Guys, this will be video 1 for APUSH Tuesday, April 28th. We're in packet 7 now. We're coming to a conclusion of the review material here very shortly. I'm on PDF page 204. Just finished progressivism. Now we're going to foreign policy and U.S. entry into World War I. So this is kind of a wrap-up of imperialism. The way the packet's kind of split it up kind of stopped at Roosevelt. So we're looking at the imperialism under Roosevelt through Wilson, and then we're going to go into World War I as well. All right, so foreign policy and U.S. entry into World War I. Roosevelt differed from his predecessor on domestic policy, but he concurred with his foreign policy. Roosevelt, if anything, was even more devout imperialist than McKinley had been. In 1903, the Roosevelt administration strong-armed Cuba into accepting the Platt Amendment, which essentially committed Cuba to American control. Under Platt stipulations, Cuba could not make a treaty with another nation without U.S. approval, and the United States had the right to intervene in Cuba's affairs if domestic order dissolved. A number of invasions and occupations by the Marines resulted. For 10 of the years between 1906 and 1922, the American military occupied Cuba, arousing anti-American sentiments on the island. Roosevelt's actions were equally interventionist throughout Central America. During his administration, the country set up its sights on building a canal through the Central America Isthmus. Because the canal greatly shortened the sea trip from the east coast to California, Congress approved a plan for a canal through Panama, at the time a province of Colombia. Because Colombia asked for more than the government was willing to spend, the United States encouraged Panamanian rebels to revolt and then supported the revolution. Not surprisingly, the new Panamanian government gave the United States a much better deal. Because American commercial interests were so closely tied to the canal's successful operation, the United States military became a fixed presence throughout the region. During the next 20 years, troops intervened repeatedly, claiming Latin American domestic instability constituted a threat to American security. This assertion came to be known as the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine and is often referred to as Big Stick policy. American foreign policy continued to adhere to the Monroe Doctrine, which asserted America's right to assume the role of international police force and intervene anywhere in the Western Hemisphere where it felt its national security was at stake. It also stated the United States wanted no part of Europe's internal disputes. American commitment to that aspect of the Monroe Doctrine would soon be tested, as Europe started down the path leading to World War I. Complicating matters was the fact the United States and England were quickly forming a close alliance. To America's benefit, England had not opposed its many forays in the Central American policies, although it could have. The British were not merely being friendly, they were trying to line up the United States as a potential ally in their ongoing rivalry with Germany, the other great European power of the era. Fortunately, you didn't know that the tangled series of events that led to Europe into war in 1914. You do, however, have to know how the United States' initial efforts to stay out of the war and the events that ultimately drew America into the conflict. Woodrow Wilson won the election in 1912, a three-way race in which a third-party candidate, Theodore Roosevelt, outpolled Taft, and Republican incumbent, the Republican incumbent. Wilson entered office with less than a commanding mandate. Only 40% of the electorate voted for him. However, with regard to the simmering European conflict, he and the electorate were of the same mind. The United States should stay out of it. When war broke out in Europe in August 1914, Wilson immediately declared the United States policy neutrality. Neutrality called for America to treat all the belligerents fairly and without favoritism. It was Wilson's hope the United States would help settle the conflict and emerge as the world's arbiter. However, the neutrality policy posed several immediate problems, owing to America's close relationship with England and relatively distant relationship with Germany and Austria-Hungary. A number of Wilson's advisors openly favored the Allies, led by the British. The situation quickly grew more complicated. England's strategic location and superior navy allowed it to impose an effective blockade on shipments headed for Germany, particularly those coming from the United States. Protests proved futile. The British government impounded and confiscated American ships. They then paid for the cargo, reducing the pressure that American merchants would otherwise have put the United States government to take action against blockade. Germany attempted to counter the blockade with submarines or U-boats. According to contemporaneous international law, an attacker had to warn civilian ships before attacking. Submarines could not do this because doing so would eliminate their main advantage. Furthermore, when the Germans attacked civilian ships, it was usually because those ships were carrying military supplies. The Germans announced that they would attack any such ships, but they did not satisfy Wilson, who believed that Germans should adhere to the strict letter of international law. Thus, when German submarines sank the passenger ship Lusitania in 1915, killing 1,198 passengers, including 128 Americans, the action provoked the condemnation of both the government and much of the public. That the Lusitania was carrying tons of ammunition to the British was a fact that received much less public attention than did the loss of 1,198 innocent lives. The sinking Lusitania and the bad publicity it generated led the Germans to cease submarine warfare for a while. Britain maintained steady gains, however, as the U-boats were Germany's most effective weapon. The Germans resumed their use. In 1916, while Wilson was campaigning for re-election on the slogan, "He kept us out of the war," Germany sank another passenger liner, the Arabic. In response, Wilson, while still maintaining neutrality, asked Congress to put the military into a state of preparedness for war just in case, increasing defense spending in peacetime. While most Americans wanted to stay out of the war, popular support for the entry was beginning to grow. Then in early 1917, the British intercepted a telegram from German Foreign Minister Zimmermann. The telegram, imaginatively called the Zimmermann Telegram, outlined a German plan to keep the United States out of the European war. The telegram stated that if Mexico were to declare war on the United States, Germany would provide Mexico help in regaining the lands lost in the Mexican War. The telegram also suggested that Germany would help Japan if they, too, wanted to go to war against America. Published in newspapers around the country, the telegram convinced many Americans that Germany was trying to take over the world. Although the public was by no means universally behind the idea of war, the balance had shifted enough so that within a month, America would declare war on Germany. War I and its aftermath. As is often the case during wartime, the government's power expanded greatly during the 3 years America was involved in World War I. The government took control of the telephone, telegraph, and rail industries, and a massive bureaucracy arose to handle these new responsibilities. The War Industries Board, created to coordinate all facets of industrial and agricultural production, sought to guarantee that not only the United States but also the rest of the Allies would be well supplied. Your production had been drastically cut by the war. The WIB had mixed success. Like most large bureaucracies, it was slow and inefficient. The government also curtailed individual civil liberties during the war. In response to the still sizable opposition to U.S. involvement, Congress passed the Espionage Act in 1917 and the Sedition Act in 1918. The Espionage Act prohibited anyone from using the U.S. mail system to interfere with the war effort or with the draft that had been instituted under the Selective Service Act upon America's entry into the war. The Sedition Act made it illegal to try to prevent the sale of war bonds or to speak disparagingly of the government, the flag or military, or the Constitution. Like the Alien and Sedition Acts in the late 1790s, both laws violated the spirit of the First Amendment, but were worded vaguely, giving the courts great leeway in their interpretation. In 1919, the Supreme Court upheld the Espionage Act in 3 separate cases, the most notable being Schenck versus the United States. Schenck was a prominent socialist and ardent critic of American capitalism, who was arrested and convicted for violation of the Espionage Act when he printed and mailed leaflets urging men to resist the draft. Schenck argued that the draft was a blatant violation of the 13th Amendment, whose ratification in 1865 abolished slavery. The wording of the amendment, however, did not mention slavery, but rather prohibited involuntary servitude. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes ruled that one's freedom of speech and other civil liberties were not absolute and could in fact be curtailed if one's actions pose a clear and present danger to others of the nation. In essence, you cannot yell fire in a crowded theater if there's no fire. These laws soon became useful tools for the suppression of anyone who voiced unpopular ideas. A mood of increased paranoia pervaded the era, heightened by the Russian Revolution in 1917, which placed Russia under Bolshevik control. Suddenly, Americans began to fear a communist takeover. Radical labor unions, such as the International Workers of the World, were branded enemies of the state, and their leaders were incarcerated. Eugene Debs, the socialist leader, was also imprisoned for criticizing the war. A new government agency, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, was created to prevent radicals from taking over. J. Edgar Hoover headed the nascent agency and continued to run it until the 1970s. Business assumed greater power, while unions lost power. Under the pretext of stamping out radicalism, businesses increased their use of strikebreakers and other forceful tactics against unions. The government helped in the Palmer raids in early 1920. The government abandoned all pretexts of respecting civil liberties, and as its agents raided union halls, pool halls, social clubs, and residences to arrest 4,000 suspected radicals. 600 were eventually deported, some for no other crime than their expression of sympathy for the communist movement. The government helped create the frenzied atmosphere through its wartime propaganda arm, the Committee on Public Information, CPI. As the war progressed, the CPI's message grew more sensational. At lectures and movie theaters and newspapers and magazines, the CPI created the image of the Germans as cold-blooded, baby-killing, power-hungry Huns during this period. Americans rejected all things German. For example, they changed the name of the sauerkraut to Liberty Cabbage. More serious were the many acts of violence against Germans and immigrants and Americans of German descent. We'll stop there for video 1.